Okay, Barry, we're live.
Okay. Okay, so we'll start now. Good morning, everyone. Thanks to everyone for attending this morning's event. Thanks also in particular to our speakers who have given up so much time to speak to us today. Our speakers today are Patrick O'Connor, who is the Registrar of the Central Register of Beneficial Ownership of Trusts, the CRBOT. Patrick is also known as Mick, so I just want to clarify that one in advance. He'll also be joined by Suzanne Sheahan, who's the Assistant Registrar. We're also going to hear from Aileen Keogan. I think Aileen will be known by most people who are attending today. As most people will know, she runs her own private client tax and legal firm, specialising in trusts and estates and general succession planning. And she also does a lot of consultancy work for solicitors and accountants. She's a solicitor, a chartered tax advisor, a trust and estate practitioner. She's a council member of the ITI. She's a member of the Sept Europe Committee. She's also a member of the Sept Ireland Committee. And she's also a member of the Probate and Trust Committee of the Law Society. At Sept, we believe the new regime is obviously very significant for our members and their clients. And we have been actively involved making representations in this area, originally to the Department of Finance in relation to the third AML directive, which obviously seems like a long time ago, as we're now at the fifth AML directive. And we're currently represented on a working group, which was established by the Register to deal with some of the practical issues that need to be addressed in this area. And we're very grateful that Aileen has taken on that role on behalf of Sept. So given the importance of the topic, we're going to have another seminar in the area at the end of year conference, which we're going to run on consecutive Fridays on the 19th and 26th of November. And we'll be sending more details about this as well. So this morning's session will be Suzanne and Mick speaking for around 15 to 20 minutes, followed by Aileen for another 15 to 20 minutes. We'll then have a Q&A session for around 20 minutes as well. Overall, we will be finished within the hour. We'll be joined by Suzanne and Mick's colleague Nick Lamorne in the Q&A session. But what I would ask people is to please feel free to use the text box to send in your questions, and we'll address them in the Q&A session. And we'll also be running two polls. So we would also be grateful if you would complete these as well. And what the polls will be before and after Aileen speaking. The slides will be available to download at the end of the session. And please note that this seminar will qualify for 1 hour of regulatory CBT for the Law Society. And we don't issue certs, but we will have a record of people who attended, and that's going to be retained by Step.org if someone needs proof of attendance. So at this juncture now, I'm going to pass over to Mick.
Thanks, Barry. First of all, just on behalf of the Trust Register team, just to say thanks to Step for hosting the event today. Thanks particularly for Barry, to Aileen, to Paulric, who's doing the technology, and to Tracy, who helped with setting up the event for us today. I suppose we have a couple of key messages here this morning. The first one is just the need to raise awareness among trustees, obviously of the existence of the Central Register, but also of their obligations in terms of firstly keeping a register, secondly making sure to file on the Central Register, and in the long term then the need to update and keep that information accurate on the register. We've had a lot of engagement with the sector in recent months in terms of the practicalities of the register, and Step have been to the forefront in that and have proved to be very good in engaging with us in terms of trying to address some of the issues. So we thank you for that. I suppose for ourselves here this morning, just to reiterate, the key message we'd want to get across is the need to engage with clients, to raise with them the awareness of their obligations under the register, the need to actually register, and the need to keep that information up to date going forward. So Suzanne, who is the Assistant Registrar, is going to go through some slides for us now just to give some further details. And I suppose the last thing I'll say just before I finish is that obviously we're here because the Revenue Commissioners have been given responsibility for managing the register, and that's the reason we're here. But we're not here necessarily wearing our revenue hats. We're here wearing our register hats. So look, with that, I'll pass you over to Suzanne, who will take you through the presentation.
Thanks, Mick. Good morning, everyone. So I'm just going to go through a brief overview, really, of the Central Register of Beneficial Ownership of Trusts and cover, I suppose, some key points in regard to, I suppose, the legislative framework, the obligations for trustees, cover key filing dates, how to register with Revenue, Revenue's role, which Mick has referred to there, the scope of the legislation and sources of help. And then I'll just wrap up with some key points for clients. So I suppose ultimately the purpose of the register is to provide transparency around beneficial ownership of trusts. And this, of course, is to contribute to the fight against money laundering and terrorist financing. So the EU has legislated for a number of anti-money laundering directives, and Barry there referred to the third anti-money laundering directive, and in 2015 there was the fourth anti-money laundering directive, and in 2018 the fifth. And these subsequently then this year, in April of this year, Statutory Instrument 194 of 2021 transposed into Irish law the requirements of those anti-money laundering directives and provided, I suppose, the framework for the legislative framework for the trust register. So in relation to the obligations, the statutory instrument lays out the obligations for trustees. So there is an obligation to maintain a beneficial ownership register. That's laid out in the SI, and that's a reference really to the internal register that trustees must maintain. And then there's the obligation on trustees to file the details on the central register. I'm just going to clarify at this point that the central register, the trust register, which you'll hear it referred to also, and CRBOT, which is, I suppose, the title there of my slides, the Central Register of Beneficial Ownership of Trusts, that's a reference to the same thing. It's all a reference to the central register. So the SI lays out that obligation on trustees to file details of beneficial owners of trusts on the central register. And that is known as the initial obligation. But there is also a follow-up obligation, which is the obligation to keep the register up to date. And that is known as a follow-up obligation, which is basically just, it's not just the initial filing on the register of the details of the beneficial ownership. There's also an obligation there to keep the register up to date. So if there is changes in beneficial owners, that must be updated on the central register. And Regulation 25 of the SI lays out that obligation to keep both the internal register and the central register aligned. And I think there's a 14-day period there for which is provided for to update the central register following an update following a change in beneficial ownership. So of course, when I'm referring to beneficial ownership details that must be filed on the central register, I'm talking about settlor details, protectors, trustees, beneficiaries, anyone associated with the trust that has any control of interest, control or interest. There is a provision there also for that beneficiaries can be described as a class of beneficiaries if that's appropriate. So there's the detail required depends on whether the beneficial owner is a legal entity or an individual, and there's a lot of information on that in our FAQ document on our website. But when you're filing the details of the beneficial ownership, a statement must be included on the nature and extent of control or interest that the beneficial owner has for the trust. And it's worth mentioning there as well that the SI specifically provides for a particular, it specifically defines the beneficial owner in terms of for charities, sports clubs and estates. So in relation to the key filing dates, I mentioned that the SI came into effect in April of this year, and trustees have been provided with a 6-month period to file, to update the register with details of trusts that were in existence on that date, on the 23rd of April. So the filing date, the first filing date for any trusts that were in existence on the 24th of April of this year is the 23rd of October. So just over a month's time is the initial filing date. And obviously thereafter there's that obligation to keep the register up to date. Any trust that comes into existence after the 23rd of April, they have 6 months within the date from which the trust came into existence to file. So next, in relation to how to register, so Revenue are hosting are managing and maintaining and hosting this register. So it is available on ROS and it is available on my account. So I would imagine that many of the attendees here today are registered on ROS as advisors or agents, or maybe registered in their personal capacity. So if you have an agent cert or a TAIN and an agent cert or an advisor cert for ROS, the trust register will be available there. The portal will be available when you log in. In that context, you'd be, I suppose, filing as a presenter, where you'd be filing details in a representative capacity. However, trustees can also file in their personal capacity, and any trustee that has a personal ROS registration can go into the trust register and file the trust details. But it is also available on my account for, I suppose, for trustees that may not have a ROS registration. If you're filing in a representative capacity as an agent or an advisor, you'll be provided, you will be prompted during the process to upload a TAIN link, just to evidence that you're representing your client. But that's not in advance of filing on the register. It's part of the process of filing. So also, I suppose it's worth mentioning there that if someone did not have access to my account or access to ROS, we can provide a TAIN specifically for the ROS register, or specifically for ROS, and that's available on Revenue's website. So Mick has already touched off Revenue's role. So the statutory instrument provides for that Revenue shall manage and maintain the register, and also it provides for the appointment of a registrar, Mick O'Connor, and an assistant registrar, which is myself. But there's also provision there within the SI for a role, Revenue's role in compliance with filing obligations, Regulation 30 and 31. They relate to the offences for failing to comply with the central filing obligation, the prosecution of offences. And Revenue's role, I suppose, is similar to, there are other central registers, the Central Register of Beneficial Ownership of Companies and Industrial and Provident Societies, and this Central Register of Beneficial Ownership of Irish Collective Asset Management Vehicles, Credit Unions and Unit Trusts, and similarly they would have registrars appointed for similar roles. In regard to the scope of the legislation, I won't dwell too long on this because I know Aileen covers it, goes into a bit more detail on this on her slides. But ultimately, the trusts that must file on CRBOT, on the Central Register, are relevant trusts. And a relevant trust is defined as an express trust. Trustees for the Irish Register, or for any of the registers across the EU, it is trustees residing in the state. If any of the trustees of the trust are residing in the state, or if the trust is administered in the state, then you become within the scope of the Central Register in that state. There is also provision in the SI for non-EU trusts that neither have any residents residing in the EU, nor are administered in the EU. There is provision there in the SI to bring those trusts within the scope of the Central Register also, where the trust enters into a business relationship in the estate or purchase property in the state, but only for the period for which they have that business relationship or are the owners of that property. It's worth mentioning as well that obviously it's possible that a trust would be within the scope of several central registers across different member states, and in that event, you register on one central register in a member state, and you obtain a certificate evidencing all the details of that beneficial ownership. And if that's the same information that's required in another central register, well then, holding that certificate and maintaining it is you're deemed to have met the requirements of other central registers. So ultimately, it is only a requirement to register on one central register if you're caught by several. Sources of help. So the Revenue website has a tile with a lot of information on it in regard to the trust register. It's not within the main body of the website, which is obviously mainly tax focused, but down in the footer of Revenue's website, you'll find a link to the Central Register of Beneficial Ownership of Trusts. And within that tile, there is a frequently asked questions document where we've tried to provide as much guidance information as possible on the Central Register. And that's a document, and the website itself that we are updating regularly as we encounter issues or we come across common queries. We've also set up a working group, which Barry referred to there at the outset, of which Sept Ireland are participating in. And this working group is to act as a knowledge and information sharing network for the trust register stakeholders and service users of the register. So that's an ongoing working group. We have our second meeting this afternoon, and there's other ongoing communications that Revenue are undertaking, I suppose ultimately to raise awareness of these filing obligations. So just to wrap up, I suppose the key points for clients is, that this SI is in effect and the trust register is there. The first filing date deadline for any trusts that were in existence prior to the 23rd of April of this year have to be filed. The deadline is the 23rd of October. This is a legal obligation on trustees. And again, just the scope of the legislation, like the type of trusts that are captured, which, in reference to the definition I provided there earlier, is quite broad. So I think that's it from me. Thanks for listening. So I think I will pass over to Aileen now.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to, and thanks Suzanne and Mick for that. I am going to go through some of the details as to, in practical terms, for STEP members, where they're going to come across the need to register when they have something in front of them and they don't know for sure whether something is registrable or not, and what they know for sure is not going to be registrable. And then there's a few sort of practical issues that I want to go through as well. So that's pretty much the gist of what I'm going to be talking about. So the first thing, as Suzanne has already mentioned, is that what is to be registered are express trusts. Now, express trusts are defined in the legislation, both in the directive and in the regulation, as being trusts that are established by deed or other declaration in writing. And from that point of view, we have been exploring and analysing what might qualify or what might not qualify. And we'll come to it later that there's a few little issues as to whether we have, where some are saying that it is caught and some are saying it isn't, and there's a little bit of uncertainty. As Suzanne mentioned, it's only Irish resident trusts. And from that point of view, it is, there are going to be updates on the FAQs or the general questions that we've asked as to what is residency. At the moment, it isn't defined, but it's going to be taken as its ordinary meaning. We had wondered whether it was going to be tax resident, but the idea now is that it isn't necessarily tax residence, it's just this ordinary meaning of residence. And you expect that every trustee has to be looked at. Once one trustee is resident in Ireland, then it is registrable here. Now, if their trustees are resident also in the EU, they might have already registered the trust there. So that's something to bear in mind. The other thing is otherwise administered in the estate. To the extent that the trust is being administered here in any way or enters into a business relationship anyhow with any designated person, such as a solicitor or such as a bank here, then they're going to have to register because the designated person is going to look to see that it's registered. If it's administered in some other EU country and has been registered there first, then that will cover it. It doesn't have to be registered here. But if it hasn't been registered in another EU country and it is going to be administered here, some asset is going to be acquired or a bank account opened, then you're going to have to register it here. And then there's another provision that if they specifically say a particular trust has to be registered, but they haven't yet covered that. So the examples of that are going to be every nomineeship going. That is, I think, really the one that they're really trying to catch from an AML point of view. They want to have people registering the nomineeship. And it brings certainty to the situation at the moment, where a lot of people could be considered to be hiding behind nomineeships after the fact. Bare trusts, so the typical children's trusts that are set up to hold the $3,000 a year provisions from parents, those or the threshold provisions, those bare trusts are registrable. Discretionary trusts are most certainly registrable, and I think everyone would figure out that that would be the case. And then I've gone through other trusts that are listed out there. One of the, when I say is pilot trust, is where you set up a trust with just €100 into which you might add things in the future, such as adding legacies in from a will. They will also be registrable, even if it is just £100 in them. So just to bear that in mind. The specific exclusions are listed out. What we are hoping is that there will be more added in practical terms, such as, and I'll come to it, a trust for vulnerable beneficiaries. The difficulty is in relation to what is not in scope. What we believe isn't in scope, but there might be a view that it is in scope. And I'm going back to the definition of what is an express trust. It's a trust that is declared in writing. From that point of view, we'd have to assume clearly that intestacies are not going to be trusts. And where there's an intestacy for a minor, that's a statutory trust. A statutory trust is not a trust that's declared in writing. The question mark is over testate estates, and this is where we have a difficulty, insofar as there are references within the regulation and within the legislation to the fact that the beneficial owner, for the purposes of the regulation, is the executor. And therefore, one would think then, does that mean that testate estates are of themselves registrable? In other words, every estate where there's a will, you're going to have to register that estate. Now, we have gone through our working group to clarify that, and we have a clarification saying that it is only estates where the will has created a trust in itself that is registrable. The difficulty I have with that is that the executor is being required to register, but the executor is holding under the statutory trust being that was created by the fact that they are holding the assets for the benefit of the beneficiaries. In this case, the beneficiary being the trustee who will be holding it on behalf of the trust. And I would myself interpret that the legislation is referring to the fact that the designated person does not have to look behind the will in actually deciding who is the beneficial owner. The will is therefore private to the designated person. And that is the reason why its executors are treated as the beneficial owner. But that of itself does not put the obligation on the on the executor to register. So that's something that's a watch this space, because at the moment, Suzanne and Mick have said, no, you have to register estates that create trusts. But one very good thing coming out of the working group is that we've got the clarification that all other estates that do not create trusts, are not registrable. Then obviously trusts where there's no connection with Ireland, or if they're already registered in another country, they're going to be caught. They're not going to be caught. I've already gone through the definition of residence, of Irish residence, insofar as when I was preparing the slides, the reply from the working group hadn't yet been published. So what I would say now is assume any connection with Ireland. If the trustees are going to be doing any business in Ireland, are going to be holding any assets in Ireland, or they are living in Ireland and therefore considered resident, not necessarily in the pure 183 days definition, then you're going to have to register. One of the things I've mentioned here is the idea of carpet bagging, or also known as jurisdictional shopping. And there will be a sense of when a trust has connections across the EU, you will find, I think, that the trustees may decide to look at our register and see whether our register is a more favourable register to be have the trust registered on as the first in. And the same in relation to non-EU trusts coming into the EU. Will Ireland be the first register for them to register on? Sorry, the first and therefore the only register that they have to register on. And that's going to be relevant to the fact that some of the other EU countries have more open public registers, whereas we have taken what is great is that the Irish legislation has limited it from a privacy point of view to ensure that it is only open to competent authorities and those with legitimate interest. And that's arising from the lobbying that Step Ireland has been carrying out since 3AMLD, that we don't have a public register as such. The next question we had was the question of default trusts. And these would be trusts that if you have a situation that a contract fails and the assets have to be held on trust, what is that trust registrable at the point of entering into the contract, because there is a trust that it only will arise in default. The same in relation to discretionary trusts, for instance, for people who are vulnerable, or any sort of discretionary trust where you have a default clause at the end, a wrap-up clause that if there are assets still remaining in the trust at the end of the trust period, that the assets would go to, usually effectively passing in the same manner as if it was an intestacy, or they name particular individuals. The difficulty with that is that we don't know if these people are ever going to benefit. Now, again, we've got the clarification that in relation to a simple life interest to A and then to B, to A for life and then to B, then in that situation, A has to be registered as the life tenant, and B also has to be registered because he has a vested interest. Even though he hasn't got it until the life tenant has died, he has a vested interest. It's a future interest, but it is vested. In these default clauses, or default trusts, they don't have a vested interest. So the view would be, now it isn't said in the workings here, it just talks about a future vested interest, and a future, even a defeasible interest, that it's vested but it might be taken away. They are registrable. But the ones that might never be registered that might never be vested in the first place, these default ones, I would take the view that they are not registrable. Again, I'm going to be clarifying that, but that's the take on it at this moment. Because at the end of the day, how do we identify those people? They might never benefit. And I have a particular case where somebody who is a discretionary trust, has a discretionary trust, and after her death, then the surviving spouse and children of the children or their surviving spouse and issue are going to benefit. All the children have died, surviving spouses are still alive but estranged, and we don't want to have to start getting into the potential for them to have to register when they might never benefit, and if they're estranged they might start causing hassle. So it's very important that we limit what we are going to register to what we actually need to register. So as I say, future interests, if they are vested, yes, they're going to be registrable now. A contingent interest is where we have the vesting, but it might be defeasible. So therefore, if the contingency is to take the vested interest away, I think we have to ignore that contingency and we have to vest it. We have to register it. We have a concern. One of the things in our lobbying over the years, it was in relation to the register being public, but it is, as I say, open to those with who can show legitimate interest. They have, in the legislation and in the regulation, they have confirmed that minors, the information for minors will not be made open to those with legitimate interest, but they haven't put an exclusion for those who are vulnerable, such as the 189A trusts or the 189 trusts, or those who are exempt from a revenue point of view under, for instance, Section 17 of the CAT Act. Those trusts are at the moment not just registrable, but they're also open to being reported to a person with legitimate interest. So vulnerable adults is something that we are concerned about. In relation to joint bank accounts, it's something that occurs to me is that we all have a situation at the end of somebody's life where we're trying to ascertain whether the joint bank account was opened for convenience purposes or whether it was intended to be a true joint bank account that the survivor takes all. If it's convenience, then the question is, what are we looking at? Is there a trust there? Was the registration of the other person on the bank account, were they holding it as trustee with the other owner? I'm not quite sure, because the other owner is still there as a beneficiary. If it is the case that his trust it was to be registered and then it wasn't, then is that a proof that it was a true joint account? It's all very up in the air. I'm still not sure about that. I've mentioned about estates that we had the concern that all estates were going to have to be registered. At the moment, we've always been of the view that an estate of itself is a statutory trust, that therefore why would the executors have to register because it is not an express trust? The legislation, as I say, says that for the purposes of who is a beneficial owner, the executors are beneficial owners, but that doesn't impose of itself the requirement to register. I read that as being they are the face for the designated person to have understanding of who is the registered owner or who is the beneficial owner. So that is something that, again, we need to just double check. But we have confirmation that estates that do not have trusts within them are not registrable. But if we do have to register trusts, estates that have trusts created in them, we have to also be careful with the likes of the nominee type trust, where you have the receipt clause for the parent receiving a benefit for a minor child, because that is a nomineeship and that would be registrable just as much as a fancy discretionary trust with lots of pages in the will. So then the other thing is the dormant account that's left in the estate long term. Again, if that's not held on trust, my argument would be that it is not registrable. At the moment, the CRBOT frequently asked questions and their clarifications are saying that it is going to be registrable because the executor needs to register while in the course of administration of the estate. So that's something that's in the reckoning at the moment. In practical terms, as already mentioned, we have until the 23rd of October. We've been told that there's that the system is going to be able to take a lot of last-minute registrations, even though at the same time the system, which is True Ross, is also going to be no doubt taking a lot of tax returns in at the same time. So hopefully there's going to be no glitches there. Bear in mind that anything else has to be registered within 6 months of its creation. What I have found in practical terms is, first of all, foremost, you have to get the TAIN link signed up by the trustees. It's not clear whether one trustee would be enough. I would take the view that one trustee should be enough to be able to upload the TAIN link. That, in other words, you don't have to have the TAIN link for every single trustee signed. Create it as a PDF to have it ready for uploading, and the best thing would be to have a spreadsheet which sets out the names, addresses, PPS numbers, dates of birth, and the what you're going to be saying as their interest. You're going to have the settlors, the trustees, the beneficiaries, the protector, anybody who's holding a veto. For instance, your life interest, you typically will give them the right to veto a sale of the family home, but they're anyhow going to be, as beneficiary, registrable. And they're all called beneficial owner for the purposes of the legislation, even though a trustee you wouldn't think of as a beneficial owner, but this is the BO, the beneficial owner for this registration. I find if you have that as the spreadsheet, that is useful to have as your updated internal register. And one of the questions that's being asked in the sheet, that the drop down that you're going through, is the date that the information was first put on the internal register. Now, there was no requirement for a internal register up until 29th of January 2019. So the obvious date is to put that date in. You don't have to go back to the date of the trust being created, and that's something that you might find you're racking your brains trying to figure it out. You have to register each person in each category. So you decide what their status is. Are they a settlor? Are they a trustee? Are they a beneficiary? And then the drop-down system runs through, and you register them for that. A few frustrations with the drop-down for residence and nationality. It starts with Afghanistan, and you have to put in Ireland, and when you put in I for, you get, I can't remember, Israel or someone like that. And anyhow, so when you're dropping down, you end up, it's time consuming just trying to get into it again. It is quite frustrating if there's an error. If you, for instance, I found that if there's something that is an error and you have an automatic trigger to go back and hit the back function, that jams everything up. So do not hit back. And I know Nicola will be saying this afterwards. The other thing I found is that if you go in and you're trying to find more documents and you go away for an hour and you start getting distracted by a phone call or whatever, and you come back to it, it doesn't save. If it's timed out, it's gone. Everything that you've put in has gone, and you have to start from afresh. The other thing is, for instance, if your date of birth doesn't match your PPS number that you have given, and I had one where the husband gave the wife's PPS date of birth a day later. He's obviously always late for his birthday present for her. That threw up an error, and then forevermore, all of this, the information I logged in at the end, when I fixed the error, it still threw up the error at the end, so I had to start afresh. So the errors basically contaminate it, and you're almost better to get rid of it all and start afresh. That can be very frustrating. I have a certain number of error codes at this stage imprinted in my mind, because, for instance, for example I have is parents setting up a bare trust for each of their 3 children. The parents are settlors, the parents are trustees. You have to enter in the parent's name once as settlor, enter the same parent, the same details in as trustee, enter the other parent twice again, and then you enter in the first child. So you've put it in 5 times into one trust. So you end up putting in the home address quite a lot. You start learning them off. At the same time, in contrast, the discretionary trust ones are actually much more easy. If you have a deceased settlor, I presume, and this is again something we need to clarify, that you don't have to actually put in the AML details for the testator or the settlor who is deceased, because they're gone. They're not going to be carrying out money laundering. They're dead. So that saves a lot of issues in relation to trying to dig up, excuse the pun, the information about the PPS number for the settlor and everything like that. But the class of beneficiaries, you do need to take up the trust document to look at who is the class of beneficiaries and give a general sense of, is it the issue of the settlor? Is it the issue in spouse? Is it charities? That sort of type of thing. That needs to be put in. And there's the boxes allows for free text to allow you to put that in. TAIN, as is mentioned, the TAIN form, you should get it as save it on your computer as a PDF, so it's easier to upload. I have discovered that although I'm on ROS, I'm not RAN enabled, so therefore none of my TAINs I'm not being prompted to file a TAIN, so I've had to register that to be sure of that. So I suggest if you're like me, that you double check, you file one, see if it prompts, and if it doesn't, then you need to start moving on getting your RAN number. It's never been a problem in any other things that I've filed for clients, but it seems to be a problem here. One particular issue that we really need to be careful about is that we have no printout of what's been filed. You're filing each individual on a screen. So, for instance, the bare trust for a child, you have a screen for the settlor, and then you add it. It then is just in a link at the bottom. You have a screen for the trustee, same person, the father. Then the same with the mother, to a settlor and a trustee, and then you have the beneficiary. So you have 5 screens. And then if you go back in to do a screenshot of those 5 screens, the drop-down menu for residence and nationality goes again. You're back to Afghanistan. So you have to enter in Ireland again. So if you do a screenshot of that, that would be your record. But it's very, very difficult to know how to manage that. When you then go and upload it and submit it to the under the ROS submission form, you get a notice number. That notice number doesn't correlate to anything. You don't. It's sorry, a record number that doesn't come up on, because we're not the trust register is not linked to the general ROS records. It doesn't come up on your record as a confirmation that is filed. So you should take a copy of, or take a cut and paste a copy of that notice number, so you have that as a record. But I don't know what that means, how that's going to be of any effect to you. When you have registered it, you go back into you actually are automatically back to the main screen of ROS, not even the trust. You have to go back into the trust register, and when you go into the trust register, you'll see the trust is up there, and it's registered based on last register in, so it's not alphabetic. It seems to be just in date order. So again, there'll be a query about how we're going to search against that in the future when we want to go back to it if we've multiple trusts registered. There's a new number that's allocated to that trust on that register. So again, take a note of that so that you have that as your record. But that's the only record you have. There's no printout shots available on that, and that's something that we have asked and are pushing to try and get, if that is possible. So the other thing that will be interesting, and it's still to be confirmed, is how this is going to work from a point of view of the designated person. The access code that they're going to be given by the trustees is going to be time limited, and they're going to be told, when, say for instance, the trust wants to open a bank account, the trustees obtain an access code and give it to the designated person, who can then go in and see and verify the information. If we as agents are registering, I don't know whether the trustees can get the access code. Are we now in a situation that everything that the trustees are going to be doing has to be routed through us so that we can obtain the access code for them and pass it on? That'll be something that we need to try and figure it out. Then there's the question of the legitimate interest and the concern that we have that information can come in. We are very concerned about the idea of the backdoor access, that legitimate interests information going through the EU, where the central register in Ireland is open to the central registrars of European countries. Would somebody then be able to access the information by going, say, through France, which is public, asking their competent authority, and then their competent authority releasing their private information for us? And that's something that we do have a concern about. I am just wanting to be concerned about, just from a point of view of, I'm conscious of time, but from a point of view of asking if you find that as a designated person that the information that the trustees have given you is different than the information on the register, we have to work out what's going to happen from a point of view of where our requirement as designated persons to inform the registrar. There's a certain amount that would be pretty obvious, that it was maybe Sean versus John, but there's also various less obvious things such as Patrick versus Mick, and so those are quite, are we required to inform the registrar, because otherwise we get penalties as designated persons for not requiring it, or do we ask the trustees to rectify the mistake and then go back in again? But if we do that and ask them to rectify an obvious mistake, is that tipping off? That's something that we need to figure it out. So the delay in registration is penalties, but also that the designated person can't act. So that's a more practical delay. So even though there may be some flexibility around the 23rd of October, it is something that we do have to keep in mind. So that's pretty much my bit. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Aileen, and thanks very much to Suzanne and Mick. We might just jump now into the Q&A session. We've actually got a good few queries, so we might jump into those now. Also, if people would complete the polls, we'd be very grateful. So maybe the first thing to raise with maybe Mick and Suzanne is just the point that Aileen made about when the legitimate interest standard would be met for, say, journalists looking to access private information. and also the issue about the sort of backdoor access where other competent jurisdictions may access private information. Ultimately, that goes public in their jurisdiction. The example of France was used. Do you have any comment on that, how that might work from a practical perspective? What sort of protections are there for, particularly for vulnerable adults, Section 189 trusts and Section 17 trusts under the CAT Act?
Yeah, I might just jump in there first, and I'll pass over to Suzanne then. Just in terms of the legitimate interest in general terms, it's not a free-for-all. The legitimate interest has to be grounded in showing that there is a legitimate interest, and it has to be released by the registrar. So it's not an automated process, is the first point I would make. Like the legitimate interest has to come in to the registrar, and then it's at the discretion of the registrar, which essentially is myself, as to whether or not to grant that particular access. And all I can say on that one is, that's a high bar to cross in practical terms on the legitimate interest part of it. In terms of the longer term then, and people referencing then the European-wide dimension, which is the idea that the registers across the European Union will interconnect. I mean, that's something that we're still essentially is a work in progress, and we're teasing out how that will work in practical terms. But I can certainly say from the legitimate interest perspective, in the first instance, they have to come and be authorised by myself. And Suzanne, I don't know, just in terms of the other question then, in terms of the vulnerable adults, the protections we have there. I know we have protections for minors and that, but for legitimate interest, I mean, it doesn't matter what the category of person is in terms of making the thing. It still has to be authorised by myself. Yeah,
and as Mick has said there, like that's going to be like a written application. It's something that's going to be considered very carefully by Revenue under the legislation. The bar is quite high there, and like Aileen has mentioned that, while protections for minors are provided for in the legislation, it doesn't specifically mention vulnerable persons. However, data protection is specifically name checked in the SI, and that is something that we are very mindful of. And, the Data Protection Act and the provisions in the Data Protection Act do apply to the, how we manage the register. So I think that's something to, I think that's a relevant point as well, and definitely something that we will be taking into consideration in regard to any requests.
Thanks.
I'm just wondering, would we be able, is the trustee going to be notified of an access request from a legitimate interest, and will it have a right to appeal any decision that has been made?
Certainly there's no right to know in regard to competent authority access.
No, in relation to legitimate interest only.
Interest, I'd have to check the legislation. I'll just check that, Aileen.
Yeah, no worries. We can get back on that one.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. One of the points that Aileen mentioned was just some of the issues with the system, and I know she specifically mentioned the printing off evidence of registration. Do you have any general comments just as regards to any improvements in the system, just addressing some of those points?
Yeah,
maybe
the first thing that we would say is thanks, and this might sound a bit of a strange one to say, but in terms of any system when it goes live, there's always it's like what do they say? No plan survives first contact. So once it gets out there, sometimes the things that need to be improved become visible. And thanks to the work, the early people in terms of using it have flagged some of these issues, which have come back to us through the working group and through other channels, which we're very conscious of, and we are actively working on to get it. Certainly the output issue, we can completely understand the difficulties that creates for people, and we're actively working on that one. And some of the other things Aileen pointed out, the things that sound simple but are really, really frustrating when you're trying to use any system, are all actively being worked at this point. I think, Suzanne, I know you've personally had a lot of engagement on trying to push some of the solutions to those issues. So I think we have some progress on some of them now. There are going to be some things that is just the nature of the beast in terms of what we're dealing with, that we can't make as easy as maybe we'd like to. But certainly on a lot of the key things that have been pointed out there, I think we look to make some progress in the short term on those.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And I would acknowledge a lot of what Aileen has covered there. There are some I suppose, some frustrating aspects of the register. But I might bring Nicola in there. Like, we're working on some fixes for some of the errors, and I think, Nicola, we have a date of the 4th of October for a fixed date for a lot of the errors.
Yeah, so there's a release going out on the 4th of October. As Aileen pointed out, there was issues with the back button. But one thing that I would say, and I know Aileen seen that if you make an error at one stage, it can lead to further errors along the line. And we would ask that if you are going to amend, if you've partially saved a trust and you want to go in and finish it off, you want to sign it off, go back to the presenter details and resubmit the details there, and then go forward, because those issues that Aileen's finding at the end of the process, we've discovered that it's due to the presenter details not being there when you go into amend. But yes, we are looking at all these issues, and again, thank you to Aileen and everyone else who has provided information on the errors. We're working on them. Hopefully now the fix on the 4th of October will have sorted all of them, and just keep sending them in if you're getting them.
And I'd agree. You've all it's the system. You've been fantastic from a point of view of getting the information, accepting and receiving all our gripes. But it is. I know you're tied with the system, so it would be great to see what happens in October, early October.
Thanks for that. I suppose the next question to ask is the consequences of missing the 23rd October deadline. Is there any potential for that deadline to be extended?
There's not going to be any formal extension of the deadline, but what there will be, I think, and I've made this point at the working group, is like we're taking a pragmatic and reasonable approach to the deadline. There are implications, obviously, in a couple of things. Obviously, the first thing in terms of the need for people to maintain their register internally. So we just want to kind of get that awareness out there, first of all, but having done that and coming to ourselves, then we want as many people as possible to register, and to register on time. And it's very important. The legislation is there, and it does provide for sanctions for late filing and that. But certainly in given that we're in the very early stages of what is a very new process for people, for ourselves and for the sector, and for people, the trustees themselves in this information, we're going to adopt a pragmatic approach to it. You know, we can never give a carte blanche and say absolutely everything's fine, but I think you can take it that anyone who's just a bog standard trust trying to do their best and doing it, we're not going to be waving the compliance flag at them as things start. Obviously, as it rolls out in due course, we'll move on to compliance activities at that stage, but our key focus at the moment is just getting people aware and to register.
But the effect of that is going to be that if a trust hasn't been registered and it does want to, say, open a bank account or buy a property or whatever, is that it needs to register to be able to do that, because a designated person is not able to act for the trust until they have verified, because a solicitor buying a property for that trust is going to have to, or else they are under penalties, they're going to have to verify that it has been registered. So that's a correlation of it. And I know that's one question that has come up as well on the chat there.
Yeah, except that, Aileen, I suppose the point I'm making is that we're not going to be like that the circumstances are giving rise to the onus on them in terms of following through, which is a trigger for them to actually make the registration, rather than us seeking to impose some sort of sanction.
You won't impose the sanction, but the designated person will shut down shop and not work for you until you're registered.
You do it.
Yeah.
The next question, which I'll jump onto, if a trust is in existence in April 21 but is wound up before October 21, must that be registered? And similarly, if a trust in the future lasts for less than 6 months, is there an obligation to register in those circumstances? Is that to maybe Suzanne or Mick?
I'll answer it there, even though I have a phone going in the background. Sorry. If the legislation provides that if the trust is in existence on the 23rd of April, but then the trust must register, even if it ceases to be in existence after that date and before the filing date. I suppose, the data is still required for the register. So even a situation where the trust is ceased and the assets of the trust have been distributed and it's no longer no longer in existence, the data is still retained for 10 years on the central register. So I think that's an important point. So that's ultimately, if it's in existence on the 23rd or comes into existence after it, it has to file on the register.
Thanks, Suzanne. Next question, just to move along. When an estate, in the context rather of an estate where a trust is created under the will, which is registerable by the executors, when does the 6-month period start? Is it until the grant of probate issues? Is that the start of the 6-month period?
Well,
or is it death?
Yeah, like what it provides for in the SI is once the estate is in the course of administration. So that's what's provided for. I don't have, I can go take that one away to provide maybe more context to it, but that's what's stated in the SI.
I think you're going to have to be the grant of probate, because the executors have no authority until the grant of probate issues. They have no authority to register. Okay.
I'll take that one away, actually. I know there's a lot of interest around the estate pieces, and Aileen has covered it there earlier on, that, it is just estates that provide for a trust, and that's very clear in the SI.
But I dispute.
Well, to me, in relation to which there is a provision for a relevant trust, that's what it
no,
says.
I know, and it's just the effect of it.
Yeah, and it does specifically state, that in the definition of a beneficial owner, it specifically states that this is that for an estate that provides for a trust that's in the course of administration, that this is the executor or administrator. So we are updating our FAQs to provide, a little bit more guidance on that. And I know, Aileen, you still have concerns around it, but
and I suppose in the case that it's an administrator, obviously, of a will annexed, because it couldn't be an administrator of an intestacy, because intestacies don't have express trusts.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
I might move on to the next question. If the registration is completed, is there a facility to amend? How does that work in practical terms?
Yeah, I can take this. So if you want to amend, you just go onto the trust register functions. That's the main page. You will see the list of the trusts that you've successfully registered. You click into it. You'll obviously have to provide your presenter details again. To avoid errors at this stage, please make sure on the presenter details page that at the top that you've picked what capacity you're presenting in, and then move through the page, put all your details on. Then you'll move on to the trust name, obviously, which will be the same, and then into the beneficial owners page. And when you go into the beneficial owners details page, at the bottom of that, you will see a list of all the beneficial owners that you have previously registered. And beside that, you will see the word amend. So click on that, the relevant beneficial owner, and go in, it'll pre-populate that beneficial owner on the page, and then you amend your details as necessary. Then when you're finished putting in your amendments, click add update. I think some people are clicking create new, and that just wipes the information. So click add update, and then move through then if you've finished, move through to the next page, where you will be asked to just sign and submit, because if you're an agent, we won't ask you again, or an advisor and who has already presented a TAIN link, we won't ask you again for the TAIN link. So,
Nicola, is that detailed on the troubleshooting document?
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
It is,
okay.
Yeah.
Next question: if you have, if there's a trust created, an example is given in the question. If a trust is created, say 40 years ago, and it's not possible to trace the beneficiary, how do we deal with that? How does it?
Yeah, there's significant guidance on the steps, or I suppose provision within the SI on the steps that a trustee must undertake in relation to locating and identifying beneficial owners. So rather than going through all the different pieces, Regulation 7 refers to taking all reasonable steps, to hold accurate information in relation to beneficial owners. And then it goes on to, I suppose, to identify the process where individuals reasonably believed, like I suppose obligations for the trustee in relation to individuals reasonably believed to be beneficial owners, and the duty to give them notice, the duty to give notice to individuals further in Regulation 9, notice an obligation to give notice to individuals believed to be beneficial owners, other particular steps that can be taken to establish the identity of beneficial owners in Regulation 10, and Regulation 11, notice the persons believed to have information concerning beneficial owners. So, like, ultimately it says taking all, reasonable steps.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of, guidance material there on what is expected of trustees.
If you have then having taken all reasonable steps and you cannot find this person, and that would be typical in relation to dormant accounts for solicitors, what drop-down menu do you use? Because you do have to add, you have to have a beneficial owner, a beneficiary as a beneficial owner to be able to register. It's not enough to register just the trustees. Do we put them in as a class of beneficiaries and just say can't trace?
I think, Aileen, that's one that we're going to have to tease out a bit further.
Yeah.
To be quite honest, and I know it was raised on the work group, this thing about the dormant accounts as well. So I think that the SI talks, as Suzanne said, are about reasonable steps. What we'll just have to do is put in the process to recognise someone has done those reasonable steps. So we'll take it away. Just if I could,
and it would be the same with no PPS numbers available as well when some beneficiaries refuse to give PPS numbers.
We'll look at all of those there. Just if I could very quickly, Barry, I just mentioned the question about legitimate interest, just to give people maybe a sense of the Regulation 27, subsection 4 sets out the legitimate interest hurdles that have to be faced, and it says that they won't be able to exercise the right of inspection unless they make a submission, supply information and documents that the registrar requires, and that may also relate to that person's previous activities, if any, in the prevention, detection or investigation of money laundering or terrorist financing offences, and that the person is engaged in the prevention, detection or investigation of money laundering or terrorist financing offences, and that the relevant trust concerned is connected with persons convicted of an offence consisting of money laundering or terrorist financing or holds assets in a high-risk third country. And after that, then that submission has to be considered by the registrar, and only if the registrar is satisfied that they have a legitimate interest, they would permit the person to inspect the information referred to in the paragraph, or refuse it. So there are quite a lot of steps there, and a very high bar, I would suggest, in terms of access.
Okay.
There is under 27.6 as well, though. Any person where there's a company in the EU, any person can look for it. And I don't know for sure if there's a bar in that one, and that's something that we can talk about later.
That's
as well.
The wider EU.
Yeah.
I'm conscious we've just gone a couple of minutes over. I might just see if I can just catch one or two questions, and we might conclude then, if that's all right.
We didn't do the poll. That's the other thing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's right.
Sorry, just to interject that we have done the poll. I can send those.
Oh, beg your pardon. Sorry.
Thanks, Barry. So, question here: there is an exemption for trusts registered in other EU states. Does this exemption extend to EU trusts that are exempted from registration in other EU states, e.g. pension trusts? I think the point is probably if there's a disparity between the excluded categories between member states, does that cause any issues?
Yeah, that is relevant. Like, if let's just say a trust is registered in another member state, and then you come within the scope of CRBOT, you only the certificate you hold from the other member state only meets your filing obligation for Ireland if the same information, if it matches the information, the exact same information, bar the PPSN obviously, is provided. Now, pensions are excluded arrangements under CRBOT, but there could be discrepancies, or there could be differences between the different registers. So it is important that you've only met your filing obligation by holding a cert in another member state if the information is the same. But
if you're exempt there, you don't have a cert, just as much as if you're exempt here, you don't have a cert. So that's the question: is if you're exempt there, would you?
Well,
if
you're exempt there and you're exempt here, well then you're not.
No, but you're not exempt here, but you are exempt there.
Well, then you have to file.
Yeah,
you have to file.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the last couple of questions here. why is there a distinction between legal entities which are beneficiaries and legal entities which are other types of beneficial owners?
That's a good question that has come up. Nicola, I might bring you in there. Like in the legislation, it's specifically. I might bring you in, Nicola.
No, it just specifically just mentioned beneficiaries, and I suppose that's what we're going on, is based on what the legislation says. So
okay.
Yeah, that's
Thanks.
it. That's what's in the SI.
Thanks, Nicola.
Yep.
Do you think there'll be opportunities to update the SI to cover some of these anomalies? Because there are some things that you don't figure out until, like as you say, just even in the system for registration, when we work through it, we find anomalies. That's one that's very frustrating for professional trustees, where they have to input the information concerning the legal entity each time as a trustee. They don't have to do it for themselves as if the legal entity is a beneficiary. But it's an amazing amount of information that they have to put in each time, all the time.
Yeah, I think, Aileen, the point we'd make there is we'll implement the SI as it stands. Obviously, if the SI changes as a result of any engagement that yourselves or anybody else has with the Minister for Finance, we'll adapt to any changes that are made there.
Will you be recommending changes, bearing in mind the information, the concerns that we're expressing? Would you be part of the process of helping the department to update?
We feed back any of the issues that are raised by yourselves to Finance.
Thank you.
We would give them the details of the working group discussions and things like that, but it's really with themselves then in terms of what decision making takes place.
Yeah, thank you.
The last question I might just hit is it anticipated that there will be a summary of what is uploaded available from 4th October?
Yeah, take that, Nicola. Yep.
On the 4th of October, really, we're dealing with the kind of issues that we're facing now, so the errors, just to help people through the process. Obviously, we've spoken to our technical team in relation to being able to allow an inbox feature in the revenue record, and that is functionality for the future. Unfortunately, it just takes a bit of time, but you should definitely see not very many errors once the 4th of October hits, but you won't see the inbox functionality available just yet.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm just conscious we've run over a bit. It's now 9:37, so we have run over a bit. I think I've addressed most of the questions, but I'll be certainly any queries that people have had that haven't been addressed, I think, to feed them through to STEP, and we'll raise them again through the working group, because it is an ongoing working group, and obviously the purpose of this is to kind of try to iron out practical issues. So I think as much feedback as possible from practitioners is welcomed. I might, unless any of the speakers would like to have just one last comment before we conclude. Yeah. Okay. Well, look, at that point, so look, thanks to everybody for attending, and a huge thanks to our speakers, to Mick, Suzanne, Nicola and Aileen. Hopefully this session was very informative, because I do think we addressed a lot of issues. Thanks also to Tracy and Porrick for all the work that they did setting up the seminar. So I think that concludes things now. So I hope you all have a pleasant day, and that the seminar is now concluded.
And we'll have the annual conference as well with this again, as you mentioned, Barry, before. It'll be mentioned again in the annual conference.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Aileen.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks, Barry.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.